All right. Well, good morning. Welcome to the OD Learning Podcast, the podcast where we explore the intersection of adult learning, leadership, and organizational development. I am your co host, Dr. Anthony Atkinson, and today I'm joined by my colleague, Dr. Kyle Zamenak. So, welcome, Kyle. Good to see you.
Well, great to be here. I think the tables have turned. I'm being interviewed today, so this will be fun.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Looking forward to our conversation. So, before we jump into our conversation today, I want to call to attention that this is our first time using this platform, the Riverside platform, and the first time us adding video to this conversation. So, really looking forward to using the features and getting to know the features of this podcast. And yeah, I think it's something new for us. We are by no means experts on this, so there'll be some bumps along the way. But yeah, looking forward to using this new platform.
I do too. Hopefully, yeah, goes smoothly. This is our test run.
Exactly. So we've received some feedback, from the three podcasts that we've done so far. Like I said, we're not experts in this, but we received some feedback about making it a more of a conversational tone. So we will definitely take that feedback and really appreciate that from our colleagues and friends. So yeah, looking forward to jumping into this conversation today with you, Dr. Zamenak. Kyle, Dr. Z. I also want to bring up the fact that, you made a mention of once of, my first initial being A and your initial being Z. So it's going to be a podcast where we learn everything from A to Z. So I think we got to get a tagline like that in there somewhere.
Totally. I agree with that. Yes. We
Yeah,
definitely have to bring in our last names in there. And
you're
then
right.
A through Z. Although I think Amazon might have cornered the market on that, but but they don't do learning. So
Yeah.
we could push against that.
So, out there in podcast land or whatever we call this, if you have suggestions, please let us know. So, we're going to start today just by getting to know you. And maybe I think, what we'll do is talk a little bit about how we've gotten to know each other. I think, as we've come to do this podcast and are still learning it and doing things, I think it'd be interesting to share with listeners and viewers now, a little bit about our history and sort of how we got to know one another. So, I'm going to toss it to you if you want to kind of kick us off with that.
Yeah. So from what I believe, this is the fun thing, an exercise of reconstructive memory, right? So if we're gonna go into cognitive psychology. So I believe we met while I was working at a coffee shop during my undergrad. So I worked at a really awesome coffee shop that was in the LGBT community called Truffles. And so Truffles was this spot where if you want to talk about third spaces where people would meet,
Yeah.
gather, and also it was really good like alternative to like the bar scene as
Yeah.
well. So I was a barista there during my undergrad. You came in, ordered some coffee. We have conversations. I'm trying to think. What do you recall from a good old Truffles?
Yeah, that's exactly what I recall. It was a space that I just enjoyed being a part of. I was kind of newer to the Cleveland scene, recently out of a relationship. And so I would always go to that space. It was right behind my house here in Cleveland, Ohio, or my apartment. And I just remember always going there, having coffee. And this is back before the days, ancient days, before we had smartphones. So you would just kind of go there with a book, have conversations, and chat with people. So you weren't looking at your phone, you were just actually having conversations with people. But yeah, that's what I remember. And then I transitioned to a number of years later, probably maybe like 7, 8 or 9 years. But we had a conversation about my being in the doctoral program at Cleveland State, and you were looking into the doctoral program at Cleveland State. So you were just starting it, and I was just ending it. And so we had conversations there about, your interest in it. And I kind of poked and prodded you to say, yeah, let's do it. You should do it.
Yeah, definitely. And I think it was a Cranes article. So Cleveland Cranes, which is a business publication in Cleveland, that I saw. It was your doctoral research
Hmm.
on the reentry program.
Right.
And I think I
Yeah.
remember it mentioning specifically your work within one, it being your doctoral research, but also because it's grounded in adult learning and the Cleveland State program, like kind of helped you with that.
Yeah, I forgot about that. It was a horrible picture. I don't know why that just popped in my head. But yeah, I remember that article talking about my work that I did with towards employment at a local nonprofit here in Cleveland, Ohio, that does work with reentry. And I was fortunate enough to have the opportunity to do my research there with the population. So yeah, that was good.
Definitely.
Cool.
So that's how we know each other. And then we came up with this idea. We wanted to do a podcast.
Hmm.
And specifically because of our backgrounds in adult learning and adult education, your expertise in technical assistance and coming from a practitioner standpoint, and then me being somewhat recent to, I mean, I've been working in academia for some time, but
Right.
more recent into a faculty role going on 3 years now. We thought it was a good place for us to kind of bridge the gap between that practitioner. So you coming from that practitioner
Hmm.
standpoint and then me coming from the academic. Although truth be told, I think we're a little bit of both. We're both
Yeah,
you're a little academic, I'm a little practitioner,
right.
so it's not like we're the odd couple here.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that that's a great lens for us to come through because I think a lot of people that are in the field of adult learning and adult education have a little bit of both and probably lean one side to the other on the spectrum. But I think it brings in a good lens for us to really have really in depth conversations about sort of what that theoretical side is on the academic side, but then how does that theory actually get placed into lived experiences of the adult learners and those that we work with within the community. So yeah, I'm looking forward to these conversations and kind of diving deep into them and yeah, going from there. So really appreciate you inviting me to the podcast.
Yep. We're glad to have you and your expertise and lived experience.
Yeah. So for today's conversation, we're going to learn a little bit about you. We had the opportunity to learn a little bit about me several months ago when I did a podcast on technical assistance. I've listened to it. I would love to go back and redo it, but that's at a later date. So
I
I
think we
think the
say that about our dissertations as well. Like, after we do our dissertations and we start to have a little bit more experience, we're like, "Oh, geez, I wish I could revisit that."
Right, exactly. Especially as you're listening to your voice, you're like, oh gosh, what was I thinking when I said that? Anyway, I think today what we want for our audiences is not only to learn about us and our relationship and how we know one another, but learn a little bit about your background and sort of, what brings you to this space and what your interests are. So really looking forward to diving in and having a conversation with you about, your academic experience, your practitioner experience, and sort of what brings you into this space. I guess my first question is, can you share a little bit about, what first drew you to academia and research and specifically your interest in adult learning?
Yeah, definitely. So, I would say adult learning came to me by surprise. I didn't know about the field at first. Um, my interest within academia came from my undergrad experience at Baldwin Wallace University, in which I was a psychology major. You could even call me like a lab rat because I was really into psychology research.
Okay.
Like, I was one of those students that I was like, "Hey, I wanna do." We had 1 thesis requirement, I decided to do 2 theses, so that was fun, but I was really into cross-cultural psychology, learning psychology, as well as understanding the innate traits that individuals have, so kind of looking at that nature versus nurture
Mm,
debate. And
okay.
so I was really interested in that. And then during my undergrad experience, got involved in research, got involved with GSA, which is a Gay Straight Student Alliance, Allies, in which I was doing one, taking a leadership role, learning about leadership, but also doing training for classrooms as well as dorms around like safe spaces or just things around the LGBT community that individuals didn't know about. So, flash forward after my undergrad, the recession hits. I'm not able to find a job. And I'm like, oh, I can't find a job. So, I ended up working at that time of Borders because that's what academics would do. When you couldn't find a job after your undergrad, you would work
Borders.
at a
What's
so yeah, yeah, yeah. What is Borders? Yeah, that. So if you know a Barnes and Noble, there used to be a competitor, Borders, which went out of business, unfortunately. And so I worked there, but then I found out about the diversity management program at Cleveland State, which was more of a practitioner based program. And it interested me because of the cross cultural differences. And so I ended up applying to that program, got to learn about process consulting, which is really about empowering clients into making their own decisions, learn about facilitation, organization development. So, really, that practitioner standpoint also is heavily rooted in Gestalt. And so through that program, I had to do a practicum experience in which I did like a program for um, a private college in which I worked with facilitation team, was able to do that. So a lot of these types of experiences were kind of building up this adult learning, leadership, and organization
mhm,
development, but I didn't really necessarily know about it.
yeah.
And then, I worked at Cleveland State as a research associate later in my career, and I had the opportunity to apply for a PhD program there in the adult learning, which I learned about through, a conversation with Dr. Anthony Atkinson. Yeah, so going back to that, and then so I felt that it really kind of resonated with my experience, what I had, and then also it
Hmm.
started leading towards my scholarship in which I led. At this point in time, I'm more a scholar practitioner, but at that point in time, I was practitioners.
Okay. All right. Very interesting. And I think, we've talked about this in some aspects before, but very similar overlaps in terms of our history and practice. And similarly, I went and did an undergrad in psychology. After my undergrad, I was like, I want nothing else to do with psychology, didn't want to do it no more. And so that's when I went into nonprofits and for a number of years started working into nonprofits. Similarly, adult learning came into my space. Someone introduced me to it. I had no idea about it, but I was really interested in sort of that training, understanding how to create trainings and programs and curriculums for adult learners. So yeah, very interesting similarities. Um, what would you say now that you're in the field? What informs your academic practice?
So I would definitely say my work is informed by being able to develop research that could be put into action. So I'm definitely not a scholar that looks at research and looks at theory for theory's sake. I really want to be able to use theory and apply it. And so I have 2 lines of research at this point in time that I'm really interested in. One is police officer development around community relations, and I kind of fell into that when I was at Cleveland State because I was given an opportunity to co-develop a police officer training program called Building Mutual Respect and Community Trust, and I was the research associate for that, so I was looking at best practices, research articles, as well as helping co-facilitate the training. And so through that experience, I was like, what is the theory that's undergirding all this? And I found out that there wasn't necessarily anything there at this point in time. I mean, there's practitioner based articles. There's article there were like research articles, but not a specific theory when it comes to the professional development of officers, specifically within community relations. And that's what my doctoral research really focused
Okay.
on. The second line of research that I'm really interested in it is the scholarly development of students, faculty members, just individuals that want to become scholars. And so looking at that process, and that happened again because of my experience while during my doctoral experience and looking at specifically how individuals navigate their scholarly development and how as a collective community to develop it. And I think your research kind of coincides with that as well
Mhm.
with your work. And specifically, I work with a lot of community of practices when it
Right.
comes to scholarly development.
Right, right. Can you say a little bit now, since you have graduated Cleveland State program and you've gone on to develop more of a scholarly practice, what is it that you're doing right now?
Yeah, definitely. So I am a clinical faculty member at the University of Idaho. And so I work with master's level and PhD level students. I work in that capacity. I also am continuing to do those lines of research that I was talking about. Specifically, now I'm looking at one exploring ethics in policing is an area that I'm writing an article on at this point in time. Looking at a specific experiential learning program and how experiential learning could potentially become a transformative learning experience for officers. And then I'm doing a lot of work in scholarly development because I'm working with a lot of students that are interested in that topic, and so we're collaborating on research.
Great. Well, thank you. So earlier you said a little bit about, your work around communities of practice. Well, I'm wondering, if you can share a little bit about how you've seen the level of identity development, whether professional or academic, happen within these communities of practice. And is that something that, you witnessed, seen, and yeah, if you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, definitely. The one I would one way that I would approach this is that my work within communities of practice really involve autoethnography.
Hmm.
And the reason why I say that's really important is because when individuals are going through either an individual or a collaborative experience, if they're able to reflect on it, when we look at experiential learning, transformative learning, they're able to create more meaning out of that experience to see what they learned and if it became a transformative experience for them. And so when looking at communities of practice, I the research that I have done has really been in that autoethnography realm. And so looking at how people perceive their own development when it comes to scholarly development. And so a lot of that, what I've learned is that the collaborative space within communities of practice really help foster that. Specifically, more in traditional PhD programs, that's great. It does work. But I would also say specifically in online programs in which students don't necessarily have those collaborative opportunities like they would, like that in person, one on one,
Hmm.
working on research, talking through problems. They have to be more intentional in that space. And so these opportunities with communities of practice allow them to have that space. When it comes to professional identity, I think there's a whole realm of research that could be explored in in
Hmm.
that space. There has been a little bit where I've seen it with police officers, came up within some of my research in which they've created spaces where there's kind of a learning community in which they problem shoot areas within community relations, like they talk through things, they talk about the day to day that they experience on the beat, and so it becomes more of this troubleshooting kind of place for them. But I think there's still a ripe area of research in which we can look at where do communities of practice happen within these types of organizations, and specifically, I'm interested in
Yeah.
within police officers.
Yeah, very similar. I think I would say I'm very interested in community of practice and how they work within particularly like social service organizations, and how do you see that professional identity being developed for individuals who are practitioners within the space. So I think oftentimes what ends up happening, you shared a little bit about, how you develop that scholarly and academic identity, but then once people leave that space and go into their jobs and go into their positions, how can organizations continue to help individuals further their education, further their knowledge, and further themselves in that space to continue to learn? And I think it's one of those things, as we talk about in adult learning, that learning is lifelong. It just doesn't stop simply because you're in school. But once you go into your position, whether it's as a facilitator, trainer, case manager, workforce, whatever that profession is, how do you continue to learn? How do you continue to learn best practices and evidence-based models from those in the field? And I think communities of practice, to your point, has a lot more research that could be done to really explore that, and how do we continue to help that identity develop for individuals as they kind of go off throughout their career.
Yeah, and I think that's an excellent point. And there's one thing that we talked about from the previous podcast with Catherine Hansman. You mentioned kind of the sharing of social capital that happens within communities of practice, and I think that's another area that needs to be explored.
Hmm.
The other thing that I think it would be interesting to see, to your point about how, when there's a community of practice, it comes together through the domain, a shared concern, passion, or practice within the community itself, in which there's the members interacting, and then there's a practice, which is a shared repertoire of resources, ways of doing things, right? When people leave that community of practice, right? So, for example, you left the community of practice when although you're still kind of community of practice
Right.
adjacent when you left Cleveland State. But there's also kind of like, where does the community of practice fracture? Not fracture, but like when there's dyads where
Mhm.
peer mentorship could come into play. So maybe in that community of practice, individuals learned as a community, but when they broke apart, there was certain members that they still go to in order to have
Yes.
those conversations. So I think that there's ripe for research, and I've seen that in action for sure.
Yeah.
I mean, that's like happening with us right now.
Yeah, exactly. I think that you hit upon something that, obviously, and we've written about this a little bit and done some research around the community of practice that was developed with my colleagues at Cleveland State, and how we came together as a group. But we were each different at different points within our professional and academic experience. And as some of us were transitioning out of that community of practice, then you were coming in. So being able to bring you in, and I think that there are sort of, splits in sort of different directions that people take in terms of their learning, but in terms of the relationships and in sort of the mentoring that happens for people who are at different stages in their career that happen. So I think that that's a very interesting topic to kind of look at and see how those developed and overlap with that in mentoring. Yeah. Yeah. What would you say are some professional development experiences, either as a learner, facilitator, or academic, that have most shaped your thinking?
It's a great question. So I would definitely say, from a theoretical standpoint, andragogy is like the to me has really hit the nail on the head
Hmm.
when it comes to working with adult learners. And the reason why is while I was at the Cleveland State program, I was talking about the before I was talking about the Building Mutual Respect and Community Trust Police Officer Training Program. I was able to see how developing that program specifically with so just to have a frank conversation, when someone goes into an organization like a police department or even a medical facility or a hospital where you're working with individuals that have their own lived experience and expertise, it can be a challenge to work with those individuals when you're someone from the outside. So, for example, me coming in being hey, I'm an academic. Let's talk about training police officers in community relations. And they're like, who are you? Why are
Hmm.
you here? You don't know me. You don't know my field. Right. And so learning about andragogy and learning how to the application of it, facilitating meaningful learning opportunities. I learned that within that training, we had to have a police officer there. We had to have someone that's going to be co-facilitating with us that has that expertise. But secondly, it's really about honoring the experience that's in that room.
Hmm.
So when we're working with adult learners and we don't honor their experience, we don't hear them out, you're
Hmm.
just going to get a bunch of resistance because they have their own way of approaching things. And it also, as a facilitator or as an adult educator, you're also losing valuable data that you can integrate within your training, right?
Hmm.
So in the moment,
Yeah.
and so those were the big things that kind of influenced. It's really that one andragogy from my adult learning program and then working with police officers. The other thing that I mentioned before too is the GSA experience that I had. That really rooted me into this creating inclusive environments, knowing that all the learners that are in that room might have different experiences. And that's great. That brings diversity in the room. There's diversity of thought. And so those 2 experiences really kind of sparked or really kind of undergird my approach to adult learning and adult education.
Yeah, and I think that's so important because you said several themes that I kind of want to pull out there, but it's about psychological safety. It's about safe spaces. It's about creating that space for the learners to feel comfortable, comfortable with you as a facilitator, as an academic, or whatever that, experience is that you're bringing into that situation. But if we are truly about educating adult learners, it's a matter of them feeling safe, feeling comfortable, and I think that that's where that moment of transformation happens is when they feel comfortable sharing. So whatever it is that we're doing as facilitators and educators, it's a matter of making sure that the individuals feel safe, comfortable, heard, and that their experience is brought forward, because that is where the rich data, the rich information is. And it's not so much even about the data that's being collected, it's about how do we transform this person's lives and how do we help them feel heard and feel safe within that conversation in terms of the work that we're doing.
Agreed. And the Gestalts would say is really focusing on creating a vessel that allows that safety to happen. And in this context, the vessel is the group dynamics, the training itself, laying ground rules, right? So saying like, we're going to have some tough conversations. We're going to be doing A, B, and C. Sometimes one technique I've used is like, let's brainstorm some group rules right now about engaging in this kind of critical dialogue because it allows that space. And then it's also kind of showing within that vessel, the facilitator being vulnerable.
Hmm.
Like a lot of times, we as well, this is overgeneralized. Well, I don't want to overgeneralize here, but sometimes there is the resistance from someone that isn't in a facilitator or a teaching role
Hmm.
to be vulnerable and say, "Oh, no, I don't know that answer," or, "Oh, I messed up there. You know what? Let me correct myself." Or,
Yes.
"That's a really good point. I didn't think about that." Because we always wanna be this not always. Some people wanna be teacher-centered, right? Where they
Right.
have to focus on themselves. They're concerned that they have to come off as, like, authoritarian. They have to be the expert versus, like, andragogy flips it. We're all in
Yeah.
this together. We're figuring this out.
And I found that's being the case, particularly in times where, as an adjunct, I've taught with students in, particularly if I'm teaching in an online space where mistakes are going to happen. And I, as the educator, have to be, comfortable saying, oh, you know what, that was a mistake on my part, got that wrong, but also just showing vulnerability. And I think that when you show that to learners and to students in that space, your willingness to be vulnerable and open creates better dialogue and trust within the learners to know that, you're human too and you're going to make mistakes. Yeah, really agree.
Trust is huge.
So, so far in our podcast, we've talked about mentoring, we've talked about technical assistance, we're talking a little bit about, professional development. Where do you see these topics, intersecting in, in terms of, what advice would you give to the field in terms of, cultivating sort of further research within these spaces and thinking about, sort of how they overlap?
I wish I was as elegant as what you did when you were talking about your technical assistance, where you're talking about the metaphor of the kitchen. But I would say this, they all go together. And so, like, when we talk about professional development is not just you're getting a credential, you're good. It's a evolving field where people are learning and the practice changes consistently.
Wait, so you mean just because I get the certificate, that's not the end of it? That's not end all be all?
No, nope, nope. not the end all be all, unfortunately. And so what's really interesting about professional development is that, you get this credential, you want to continue your education, that lifelong learning piece, right? And so one way to do that lifelong learning is through mentorship, right? So you're going in an organization, maybe, and you're learning about the organization or navigating that organization. You can get a mentor to do that. You can get mentors for, a lot of other things too, but specifically with an organization, we have mentors in that space. Coaches, right? Coaching through the process of navigating tough organizational issues as well as life issues as well, right? And then technical assistance about how do we use the tools that are available to us, right? In order to achieve the outcomes that we want, right? And so these all are kind of going together and all undergirding this is adult learning, right? Organization development as well, if we're going to do in the context of organization development, as well as leadership.
Hmm.
And so I think when it comes to this podcast, we're really kind of I'm not saying we're not scaffolding the experience per se, because we're not saying like, do this and that and this and that. But we're kind of giving a menu of tools or a menu of options for individuals in order to navigate whatever type of like problem that they're trying to navigate at that point in time.
Hmm. Yeah.
And that could be like organizational, it could be leadership, it could be research,
Yeah. Yeah. I think what I love about that is, and I'm going to go back to this word, and I'll probably say this too much when I go back and look at it. It's just the lived experience. It's about the lived experience. And I think one of the things that I have always pulled from adult learning is that, there are the theories in the books, there are the academics, there are the theoretical ideas, but those theories come to life when you look at it in terms of the lived experience. You sometimes don't get that until you have the conversations and see the intersections that happen between these different fields. So you could have a field that's mentoring, you could have something that's technical assistance, professional development, and to your point, there's overlaps and intersections between them. And so what I'm hoping this space becomes is that place where people can begin thinking about what those intersections are, what their interests are, and feel comfortable to have those open conversations and dialogue to dive a little bit deeper. That just because you see the theory in a book, okay, great, you can talk about the constructivist theory. All right, but what does that mean in an actual practice? And I will say, in my own academic experience, it was great to be able to read that in a book. And it's like, oh, okay, I think I've done some of that. But then to go back and think about how do I apply that as a facilitator and trainer when I'm working with people in a space every day? And it's not as easy as it looks in the book because you're working with people's real lives. There's always fires that you're putting out as a trainer, as an educator, as a program manager. So, what does that look like to actually construct that and help individuals through that in the real space? So, yeah, I'm hoping that this space becomes a place and space where we can talk about that and help people explore what that looks like and how to begin developing that within their organizations and living the theories.
Yeah, definitely. And I think this space also, and we've seen this already in action, where we start to identify because we're talking about, well, me, I'm not a leading researcher yet. Maybe eventually, knock, knock, knock. But with these leading researchers and these scholars in the community, through our conversations, we're also identifying some research gaps. And so, for example, when you were talking to Catherine Hansman and you were like, what are the kind of the tools? What's the tool bag in because you're coming from the technical assistance kind of standpoint when it comes to mentorship? And she's like, well, there really isn't anything at this point in time in the scholarship. And you identified that gap in that moment.
That's right. And we're supposed to go back and talk about that some more. I think that was the topic. Yeah. So,
It'll
okay.
eventually happen amongst
File save.
I'll say it. We have the
Yes.
transcript now.
Yes. Thank you. Very good point. But to that point, also, as we talk about research gaps, what do you see are some trends within professional development that are sort of, as we think about we're in 2026 now and the future and things with AI and all that. So, what are some trends that you see within professional development that maybe those who are in the field maybe should think about?
Yeah, I mean, you just said it, right? You just took it away. I mean, so AI is our biggest challenge right now when it comes to professional development. And so I don't want to, there's a school of thought where people are resistant to it. And I get it because there are potentially, like, if you go to, I think the website's Will Robots Take My Job, right? So some jobs will potentially be replaced by AI. They won't exist any longer. And then there are roles in which AI is going to complement. And I think that in order to get ahead of the AI curve, and honestly, it's consistently evolving, is that professional development or individuals that are just work professionals or professionals in general need to have an understanding of AI, and they have to have it so that they're able to apply it to whatever type of role that they're doing. Because if they're not, there's the potential that they're going to not make it in the job market later down the line
Hmm.
because the AI is going to be required. So I think that's the biggest thing. And also there's limitations. That's the other thing about I should say about this too is that in those types of development opportunities in which AI is being used or learning about AI, we also need to create critical thinking when it comes to AI use. And when AI is giving us bogus answers, hallucinations, pointing us to the wrong resources. So we still have to have a foundational knowledge on whatever subject area that we have
Hmm.
in order to know that whatever output, whatever that we're using the AI for the tool is, that it's actually going to be truthful to the
Hmm.
extent that it can be. The reason why I can give an example. So I think a recent article it was shared with me from that I was talking about the building mutual respect, community trust. So the facilitator, the police officer, sent me an article about how AI is using for police officer notes. Right.
Hmm.
So every time officer has to write a report, I mean, it's a tedious process. So they're starting to
Hmm.
use AI to do that. And there was a concern that within that, it's not going to be accurate. Right. And so what really happens there is that eventually AI, and I know this for a fact too, is like AI is being used for notes across the board. It's being used for career development. So if you're seeing a coach, AI is being used for that. If you're seeing a therapist, they're also using AI for their notes too. If you're seeing a doctor, they're using AI. And so what it really is important to know is that to be critical about that output and be trained on that. So not you're not just trusting AI blindly, but also, and this was the point, this is what the officer said. He's like, supervisors are also put into they should review the notes for accountability. And so there should also be accountability mechanisms built into whatever, even if you're using like so for AI for the notes, great, but also AI for training. Create some type of review process where you're working with other individuals within that organization to see if it's true or not, right? Based on
Hmm.
their experience. And
Yeah.
this is all foundational stuff. That's like the planning table right then and there. That's about
Right.
accountability. It's about evaluation. So
Yeah.
those are
No.
kind of the perspectives.
100%. You hit on so many different topics that we could explore if we had more time. But definitely, I think that this will be something that we'll come back to in a later podcast. But what I just want to follow up on is, you hit something 100% where you talked about career coaching, workforce. It's changing the landscape of workforce. And so already I've been involved in conversation and some of the work that I do around workforce that talks about the need to know what AI is, how to use AI, and how to critically think about AI. It's not going anywhere. It's here. It's here to stay. So how do we begin thinking about the changes that need to happen within our work, how we train people, how we educate people, how people learn, and what the influence of AI is? And what I kind of liken it to is if we go back, I don't know, 15, 20, maybe 30 years, and we think about sort of the onset of even the internet. I can remember a time, don't want to give away my age, but they think about a time where the internet didn't exist. And so there was a point in time where the internet started to come about, and there was that level of distrust that people had about putting something online and searching for it on Yahoo, AOL, now Google, and thinking about where's this information going, how is it searching this information, and there was just this level of distrust, but training that we had to do in terms of bringing people up to speed to feel comfortable with it, trust it, but also know what information to share or not share. So I think that we see this new age of a transition happening where now AI is becoming sort of that new focal point of gaining information, getting information, and figuring out how to educate people to search it, trust it, but critically think about it. But I think also part of where my hesitation is at is also the thing about the gaps that happen within communities that are still not having access to technology, period. So we have to begin thinking about that. So if we're still having issues with people not having access to Wi-Fi, internet, computers, all right. So if that group is already left behind, this even widens the gap even more. So what do we do to begin critically thinking about that to bring people up to date and up to speed? So I think that those are definitely conversations I would love to kind of continue to have at some point.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. Excellent point
Hmm.
about inclusion and when it comes to access.
Yeah.
Excellent.
So, when you think about your field and your profession, or where you're at now, you said you're still, kind of emerging as a scholar. What advice would you have for those, our listeners or people who are listening who consider themselves wanting to get into the field? Is there any advice you would give to them?
So I would say definitely joining professional communities. So develop like looking at whatever type of field that you're going into. So for example, if you're going into adult learning, joining AAACE, looking at AERC, looking at some of those professional, those are conferences, but also professional organizations, and they have different types of organizations within those. So you're learning about the practices. I would say looking at some of the research if you have access to it within your field. Sometimes it's like people get I don't know. It's academic research, but it's good. I mean, so some of the articles are open source that you're able to access. Some of them are available through Google Scholar. You can go to your public library to look at some of the resources as well. If you don't have access to the university resources, definitely looking at those, as well as best practices that are out there through those professional organizations. I would definitely say looking and developing your own community of practice. That's like icing on the cake. If you're able to do that, it's awesome. um, those are kind of the big ones. I also would say like attending conferences if possible, even as a practitioner. A lot of these organizations that are specifically within adult learning, leadership, and organization development are open to practitioners. They're not just scholarly conferences. Some of them are tend to be a little scholarly leaning, but they still want the practitioner voice involved in the conversation. So I definitely encourage you to do that. And to go to the point back to like the community of practices, find your community, find people that support you through this process, find people that challenge you, and have time to engage in dialogue, right? Critical dialogue with someone through that community in order to challenge your thinking and explore new opportunities. Cause I think there's so much that I've learned either just through this podcast doing it, as well
Hmm.
as just conversations with like in at conferences or just with colleagues that have changed the way that I think about things. And so
Yeah.
engage in that. We're in a society at this point in time where we're trying not to engage in that as much. And we like to hear, social media, we're going to be like, okay, this is
Mhm.
the stuff that I want to hear that supports what I want. Lean into some challenging conversations. Lean into being uncomfortable because it's for your own learning. So that's a little bit of advice.
Yeah. I would add to that, lean into, and this is what I had to do, lean into your professors, lean into the professors that you are working with that are a part of, your program. And don't underestimate one, their level of social networks, connections, and knowledge, and that they're not just there to teach you, but they also have experiences with of their own. So it's having those conversations with them, and if there's something that sparks you within their research or those things that they're doing academically or scholarly, is expand upon that, look into that. And, I would think from my own experience, and I think you would agree with this, we've had some very great professors within our program that, have really helped us shift our thinking and challenge us in ways to kind of think about adult learning differently, lifelong learning differently, but have not just been our professors, but have become colleagues of ours that we still have connections with today. And so I think that that's very important as if you're new to the field and kind of emerging, is to really think about, the professors that you're working with and having those conversations with them and, as colleagues and seeing them as colleagues, not just sort of your professors.
I like that point about seeing them as colleagues. Now, just kind of flipping it where I'm the professor now. What I have learned is I didn't learn this. I know that I don't know everything. And when I was a student, I was concerned about oversharing because I didn't have the knowledge base. But what the truth is that I learned so much from my students. And I don't even want to say my students, my colleagues, the people that I'm with, right? Because they bring their own knowledge, but they also have their deep dive within their subject matter expertise, right? So like, I mean, you came in talking to Kate Monahan and jumping into that a deeper dive within what reentry is. I'm not sure if she even knew that much about that population. And so you brought that expertise and I'm sure she was learning while she was doing that type of research with you.
Yeah, you bring up such a great point because again, I'm going back to the last class that I taught that, and I think that's what I love about adult learning is that everyone comes from a different discipline and they bring their different experience into the learning environment. So with the last class that I taught, you had people from healthcare, you had people from student services, you had people from, who work with, social service organizations. So there's just a number of different organizations where adult learning principles are embedded within the work. And as an adult educator and professor, I love seeing those aha moments where you have someone who's in HR and they're like, oh, well, duh, this relates to exactly what I'm doing. And they begin to see sort of how to unpack those learning theories within their everyday practice. So I just love all the differences in terms of career paths and things that get opened up. And to your point, yes, I'm learning about, the last class I had someone who did medical tattooing and never heard of it, never heard of medical tattooing at all. But it was for people who have, body scars. And I'm not going to do this justice, but someone who had body scars and being able to deal with the trauma of those body scars and then to sort of own it and using tattoos to sort of make it look more appealing or aesthetically pleasing to the eye. Yeah, the fact that there was adult learning principles within there. So just sharing on that's just something that you have to be open to the conversation and willing to explore that and have those critical kind of conversations and explore what you don't know, and it leads you down those paths.
And it also stresses the importance of how adult learning and adult education, like the field matters. This discipline has so much application across any type of discipline.
Love it, love it, love it. So I think that's perfect for us to kind of this final question that I have for you. As we embark upon launching this podcast, what are your hopes for this platform, which you've kind of shared a little bit already?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. So that last point for sure, but it's to elevate, like one big thing is to elevate the voices of scholars that are actively doing research right now.
Hmm.
So trying to get their voices out there, get that research out there, because the field of adult learning is often like a lot of people don't know about it, unfortunately. And so being able to elevate those voices. The second is to preserve the voices of historical scholars. And so being able to look at what is the foundation of adult learning and how have those theories developed? Like where did they come from? How they developed and where are they now? So I think that historical preservation's huge. The bridging the scholar practitioner divide is another huge one, and you talked about that. It's really about, like, we don't want our research just to sit on an ivory shelf where people can't access it. So this is a way that we can engage in meaningful dialogue between scholars and practitioners and bridge that gap. And then the other thing is just to make things interesting. I mean, so, like, there's a difference between, and trust me, I love a good textbook. I love a big, heavy textbook, right? And so it's great. Like you love it, you page through it, you know your resources. You're like, I have this knowledge base. It's great. But for some adult learners, that doesn't necessarily work. And so being able to create a podcast as well as like a video now in which we're able to make the content more interesting and applicable to those. So again, this is like everything's andragogy. We're just like kind of rooting this all in there, undergirding it. So that's kind of my expectations. Any expectations that I mean, I think I hit the plethora of the reasons of why we're doing this, but any others that you want to add there?
I think you hit the plethora definitely of a lot of the same things that I'm looking forward to. I think I would add to that what I see this as also is re-examining the opportunity where adult learning has set at the intersection of human rights, civil rights, social rights, and just really that intersection of making sure that people's rights are respected and that there's a whole host of history that is there that often doesn't get talked about enough. And so I want us to be able to open up that space to be able to talk about the ways in which adult learning has, lived at those intersections and what it means at that level. And I think that, part of that lends into some of the conversations that we'll be having on our next podcast. So as part of our next podcast, we will be having a conversation with Dr. Gretchen Birch. Gretchen is a professor emerita of the University of Alaska Anchorage. She's a profound scholar who has done several interviews over the years with some of the great foundational theorists of adult learning. These archives have been shared and listened to and are with some of the great theorists that a lot of students read about in their books. And so I think part of our next podcast is to really talk with Gretchen, hear from her in terms of these interviews and share some of her interviews. And so I really appreciate that she's going to join us next week and share sort of what her vision was for these interviews and some of the great theorists that she's talked to and how how we can learn from them today and to bridge that, period of, who the theorists were yesterday, what that looks like in a contemporary setting, and what it means for us kind of going forward in the field of adult learning.
And to the point with access, one thing that she is going to be doing, so at this point in time, these videos have been archived as DVDs, and she also has raw footage when it comes to it. So some of us may have been exposed through to these interviews through like getting a DVD. She is going to be working towards preserving and getting these videos out either through some type of like YouTube channel or podcast, but she's also allowing us to pull in these historical interviews for this podcast in order to get the word out there,
Yeah.
spread these historical interviews so people have access to them. So I'm
Yeah.
excited. I'm very
Yeah.
excited.
Very excited. And to your point, yes, I'll underline again access. I think it's just access to these voices and to these conversations that, people may have not heard before, but really being able to think about how do we bring that into sort of a contemporary setting and think about how do we expand on those conversations, but then blend that into who are some of the contemporary researchers and people who are doing work now. And has much changed, has a little change, has a lot changed. So yeah, really looking forward to getting into that conversation with Gretchen.
And to kind of close us out, so if anyone has, like, if you want to be interviewed, if you're a scholar or practitioner, if you want to be a guest on the OD Learning Lab, feel free to email us. It's odlearninglab@gmail.com. Again, that's odlearninglab@gmail.com. And we'd welcome, and you can even bring in your own questions too. If there's something that you want us to address that feel like we haven't addressed, or something came up during this interview that you want us to address in a future podcast, just let us know.
Yeah, looking forward to it. Well, Kyle, thank you. I appreciate the conversation today and looking forward to, moving this podcast forward. And yeah, thank you for the conversation today.
Excited to see where it goes.